Hello, I'm Steve Crescenzo and welcome to my shop. Today we're going to talk about rechucking systems, how to finish a piece that to get that last part off the bottom that needs to be finished, or mainly on bowls, but it can be used for other pieces as well. We're going to talk about various methods, but really that we're going to focus on vacuum chucking because that's really one of the more complicated systems to get set up, but we will talk about the other options. Would like to start with just a quick safety minute though, that when you're working with any rechucking method, you really don't have the security of whatever holding method you use when you're doing the primary part of your work. And therefore the holding system is not going to be, whether it's a jam chuck or a vacuum chuck, whatever system you're using, it's not going to be as secure as the original method. So you have to take that into account with the speed that you're working with, the aggressiveness of your cuts, the direction of your cuts, and all that needs to be considered as you finish the work. So, what we're going to cover today is we're going to talk about some the variations in the systems. We're going to talk about maintenance and particularly with the vacuum chucks, how to set up a vacuum chuck system, what you need to do to maintain it, the various attachment methods, the various hardware you're going to need, and we're going to talk about generating or creating vacuum chucks and how to make them and the various applications you can use them for. So with that, let's just talk about some of the rechucking methods you can use. A lot of people, when they make a bowl, they get to this point where they have a finished bowl, and if you've used a recess or a tenon, whatever your choice is, that a lot of times we'll see that this is what some people consider a finished bowl. And you'll notice that when people, particularly in art markets and stuff, when people look at your work, one of the first things they do is they'll turn it over like this. And in my opinion, that this isn't a finished bowl, because you can still see the attachment method on there. You got sharp corners on it, and often you'll see remnants of the chuck that was in there when you had it mounted for turning. So you need some means to, after you've turned the outside, turned the inside, and held this with a chuck, how do you come back now when it's all finished and hold this to get this bottom finished? I prefer to have a bottom that different people have different methods. The bottoms of my bowls, I tend to just put a very subtle foot. It's got to be slightly concave in there so it'll rest on the table, but it is a finished piece. And again, there's no visible evidence of how you are holding this on the lathe. The center part's gone. You can see it on some of these other ones. Again, just sometimes you can have a little bit more pronounced foot on there, but again, the chucking method that was on there is gone, and to me that just creates a much more pleasing piece than if you have something like this where you're still showing the where the chuck held onto it. So how do you get, when you have this finished piece on here, how do you get to the point where you can turn that bottom off, and what you need to do is some means to hold it back onto the lathe. So there's various methods you can use. It starts with the simplest, is just using some sort of jam chuck, and this is just a piece of ash that I turned. It's got a convex head on it, and on this piece I have this threaded, so it'll thread onto my spindle, but you could just mount this into a chuck instead. And so this just threads on. I'm not going to put it all the way on, but and then what you typically do is you would take some kind of foam pad and stick it on there, put this on here, and then you would bring your tailstock up and hold that on there. Right now, the advantage of this, and let me just get another piece that has a center point on it. So I've maintained the center point from my rough turning. You just put it on here, and that's, at this point you could go ahead and finish this. Now, the disadvantage is that you need the tailstock to hold this on here. So you can't take this all off, but you can get down to the point where you just have a small nub left on there, and then you can just sand that nub off when you get to it. But that's the simplest method. It requires, other than a scrap of wood, it requires no other equipment. It's cheap, it's simple, and the downside is you just need to get this to the point where you're going to just sand this little piece off. Another advantage of this is you can use it with an irregular shaped piece. So if you have a natural edge bowl or something like that, you can actually put this on here. It's not relying on the rim of the bowl in order to hold it onto the lathe. So that's the most basic method. And again, you can use any kind of foam pad on here. This is just drawer liner material. You can use. I tend to save a lot of my foam packing material. That also works on there. A mouse pad works. An old mouse pad works great because it has a little bit of grip to it. So that's the simplest method. Another method is often used by Ashley Harwood is the master of this. I rarely use it, so I'm not as good. But Ashley is very, very proficient in using a jam chuck, where she will take this, and this is just a block of maple held on with a chuck. And if you do this right, this is just a small bowl that just needs the foot turned off on it. And if you do this right, you can get a snap fit on there. And yesterday when I did this, it did snap fit in there. Things have changed overnight, but it'll hold on there, and she can just snap it in. Or if you're worried about hold, you can actually put your tailstock up and hold it on there for a little bit more security, or even use tape on here. So it's on there. It fits there pretty well, and you can go ahead and finish that foot. And the advantage is that, particularly if you put a couple pieces of tape on here to hold it, that you can actually get the whole bottom off. You don't have to worry about that, sanding that little nub off when you're finished. So that's a method. And again, if you want to see how to do this, I can't demonstrate it because I'm just not nearly as proficient as some people like Ashley are. But there's a couple of YouTubes on video with her doing this, and she gets this pop fit on there that holds it on very securely. All right, so that's one of the downsides of this. It is simple. It doesn't require a lot of materials. One of the downsides is that if you're turning a good-sized bowl, that you need a piece of stock that's equal to the diameter of your bowl in order to make this work. So that's a lot of material to have around if you're going to do it. So and then the other thing is you need a consistent rim across the top that you can't do with an irregular shaped piece or a natural edge piece if you're going to do it. But it will hold it securely in there, and again, put a little bit of tape on there. And if you're careful with it, again, you just have to be careful when you're doing this that you don't cut too aggressively. It will hold on there just fine, and you can make it work. So the next method is jumbo jaws. These jaws fit onto these are made by One Way, these particular ones. This is on a Stronghold chuck. Here's another one that's on a Talon chuck. Two different sizes. And these thread on. And again, you would you just the stoppers to hold your bowl. You bring this in, and you use your chuck to hold it on there. And it gives you free reign to do. You can do the total finishing on this, and it's very secure if used with the proper precautions. They do have some speed limitations you need to look at. I think on this one, this says 1,000 RPM. I think the small one's 500. But you do have to be careful with these. I find them a little bit disconcerting to use because you got this, you can be working on something this size, you got this big rim spinning around it up to 1,000 RPM, and that can do some damage on your fingers if you're not careful. So it does require some care. Personally, I wouldn't run this more than about 500 RPM. A couple disadvantages of this. I mean, I started with these, and I have the 2 sets, and I used them for years before I got my vacuum system. Since I got my vacuum system, I really don't use them. But one of the disadvantages is the cost. They're about, I think the small ones are about $100, and these ones are about $140 or $50 just for the jaws, not including the chuck. There's the time that it takes to transfer jaws on the chuck, which again, if you're trying to do production work, that is a bit of a disadvantage unless you have chucks you can dedicate to it. And you're limited to, again, a straight edge bowl. If you were to do either a natural edge, obviously you can't hold that on there. There's no way to hold that on there, or I do some of these lens-shaped pieces that don't really have a flat surface on them to go on there. Again, they're not going to be able to mount on there. So, but they are a very secure. It's a good, reliable method to use. Again, that you can put different size knobs. You can put higher knobs on here if you need to. If you have something that has a broader rim on it, it's a pretty good method. Similar to the jumbo jaws in holding method is the Longworth chuck. Uses a spiral instead of turning it with. It doesn't require a chuck. It uses a spiral method on your knobs, and it will kind of turn right in. And so again, similar holding power to this. And it has similar disadvantages and advantages to this. One of the disadvantages is the cost. If you're going to buy one, they're $150 to $200 depending upon the size. Although a lot of people, including some of our members, have made them, so they're not that difficult to make. With a little bit of router work, you can make your own and put it on. So that's the Longworth chuck and the jumbo jaws. And finally, the last method we're going to talk about today, and the one we're going to spend the most time on, is the vacuum system. So a vacuum system uses negative air pressure to hold the work onto the lathe, and depending upon the size of the piece and the vacuum that you have, it will hold with several hundred pounds of work. With several hundred pounds of force to hold your piece onto the chuck. So there's a variety of vacuum chucks. We're going to talk more about chucks in a little bit, but essentially you put a chuck that has some kind of gasket on the front of it, and then you take your piece and put it on, and you apply a vacuum through your spindle, and that piece will be held on there, again, depending upon the size of the chuck, with a fair as much force as that is necessary to finish the bottom. The advantage is that you have full control over the bottom. You don't need a tailstock. It's good to use the tailstock when you get it centered and when you're starting out, but you can, when you're to the point where you're going to finish the piece, you can get it and remove the tailstock. If you were to go with another advantage is that you're not restricted by size. So if you were to have a large piece, in this case this is about a 28, maybe 18-inch platter, bigger than the jumbo jaws, bigger than it would take on the Longworth, and you certainly wouldn't want to try to put this in a jam chuck. So you can take this and hold it on here, and it'll hold on fine. Again, you're not limited by the by the size of the piece. So you can do irregular shaped pieces. The way I finish when I create these lens shaped pieces, I have a glue block on these to start it out. I do one surface, and you'll see there's no place to hold this to turn the back side. So I turn the entire back side of this piece using the vacuum chuck. I use my tailstock initially to get the rough shape, except for the very center. But when I remove the tailstock, that is held on there secure enough to go through the rest of the turning and finishing process. So there are times when this provides holding power that there's really no other way to do, in my view. Since I've started using the vacuum system, I rarely use any other kind of holding method, because there's very few pieces I've found that this doesn't, I can't adapt some means to make this work. You can use a variety of different chucks, either homemade or store-bought, and therefore you can use chucks that you can adapt to whatever system you're using or the shape of the piece. And again, we're going to talk about how to make some homemade vacuum chucks here later on, but I was doing some pieces, some vase shaped pieces that had a long taper on them, and I actually made this chuck to have those fit right inside here, the head of those, instead of holding on the end. And so you can, by making these out of PVC, you can manipulate the shape of these to whatever shape that you need to be turned. So the disadvantage of the vacuum system is that, one of the disadvantages is that it is expensive. And they require some setup. So you need a vacuum pump, and we're going to talk about the components you need, but it does require a separate setup. The advantage is that once you have it and your system is set up, it's so quick and easy to use. In my system, I have a vacuum pump ready to go. I have a quick connect that connects to the lathe. The chucks are right behind me, and when I get to the point where I need to finish something, it's a matter of minutes till I'm set up ready to go on this. So just an idea of cost, probably one of the best places to buy a vacuum system is there's a website, a company called Frugal Vacuum Chucks, and they sell a complete package including the pump and all the fittings for about $315 to about $325. It does require you to do some of the fabrication yourself. It doesn't include any specific chucks. You have to make the chucks yourself, but it gives you the materials to make the chucks. So that's kind of an entry point, and we're going to talk about. The heart of those systems is the chuck. The vacuum pump, and what comes with that system is a very good vacuum pump. So what do you need to create to set up a vacuum system? Well, it starts out with the pump, the vacuum pump, and like I said, you need to have a very it's the heart of the system. You do not want a pump that's going to let go in the middle of holding a piece on your lathe, and it could cause not only injury to you, but it could damage a piece that you spent a lot of time on, because it is holding the very last step in the process. So you want a good, reliable pump. Again, we'll talk about various types of pumps in a minute, but you want a pump that's and in my view, it's better to have a pump that's set up and dedicated to your vacuum system. As an alternative to a vacuum pump, a number of people use a Venturi vacuum generator that is hooked up. That uses compressed air from your compressor to create the vacuum using the Venturi process. They work. They are a little bit limited in the volume of air that they can vacuum that they can move. So if you're doing a very porous piece with some punky burl or whatever it is that you're trying to hold, they can be somewhat limiting with the Venturi systems, but they work. It's a very they're about $80 or $90, so it's a fairly economical alternative to buying a $250 pump. The next piece you need some means to get the vacuum through your headstock. And that requires some form of adapter. And there's two methods really actually three methods you can use. Probably the simplest and most universal is this system that I've had for a number of years. I believe this was made by Holdfast. Craft Supply sells something similar to this right now. I think they changed this piece. It's a sealed bearing on this end with a quick adapter on it, and then just a piece that fits in here and holds into this end of your headstock. The other end feeds into your tailstock, and you can just thread it on and connect your hose to the end. Very reliable, and what's the beauty of this is it can be used on any lathe just by changing the length of this rod. Back when I had my Powermatic, I had a different, and this is just lamp rod, so you can go to any home center and buy a 3-foot piece of lamp rod, cut it to the length you need, and it adapts to the lathe very easily. So again, very, very easy method. If you have multiple lathes in your shop, this is a good way to do it because you can adapt it to any lathe. You can also make your own, and again with the kit that comes from the Frugal vacuum chuck, they have the plans to make that system, another system that will fit into your hand wheel. Most hand wheels have, all hand wheels should have a hole through them, and they make a system. And the important thing is if you're going to make your own adapter, make sure you do something with sealed bearings, because if you don't use sealed bearings, you'll lose all your vacuum through the bearings, so you don't want to do that. And then the third way to do it is to just buy an adapter, and this is very similar to what you would make if you're making a homemade one. This one is made by Robust for this lathe, and again it's sealed bearings. It's got 2 O-rings on it, and it simply fits into the end of the hand wheel and allows you to hook your vacuum pump up to it. So those are the various methods for getting the vacuum through the headstock and into your vacuum chuck. The next thing you need is various fittings and hoses. Again, on my system, it's going to be hard to show this really, but I have the pump mounted up above my lathe. And that just was a convenient place to put it out of the way. And again, it's a pump that's dedicated to vacuum chucking. I have a hose that comes down from the pump, and I have a vacuum gauge, which is another component that you have to have because you need to know where you stand. As far as whether you have sufficient vacuum coming through to hold your piece. I have a bleed valve on here, and what this does is there are times when you're dealing with a very thin-walled piece that the vacuum will actually pull enough that it can break your work, or you can actually watch the bottom of your piece being distorted as you apply the vacuum. So there's times when you need to bleed a little bit of vacuum from this. This isn't required, but again, if you're dealing with very thin-walled pieces, I have had pieces break when the vacuum's applied, particularly with the larger chuck. So this just is a needle valve and allows you to bleed off pressure or vacuum from your system. I have a switch right here that allows me to easily control the pump, and then from that another line that comes down, and I have a hose with a quick connect. This is just nylon hose that you use for your refrigerator, tubing, your ice maker, and with a quick connect. And the quick connect would just fit right onto the adapter that goes into the hand wheel. One word about quick connects. Quick connects are not really designed for vacuum. Some of them will work and some of them won't. but most quick connects are designed for compressed air, where the pressure of the air forces the connection to be sealed. I found that there are some quick connects that don't work with vacuum. So if you find one that doesn't, you just need to be aware of that it can cause leakage in your system. A couple other pieces of hardware, depending upon the pump, you may need an exhaust filter if you're using a pump that has oil in it. We'll talk about that when we break down some pumps later. But one thing that I don't see in many systems that I do recommend is putting a filter on your intake. And I just have you can buy these paper filters, and they're meant for vacuum systems, and they're a paper filter inside a canister. And after using my pump for about a year, I was doing some maintenance on it, and I took that filter off, and there was a fair amount of sawdust in that filter. And all that sawdust would end up in your pump if you're not using a pre-filter as it goes in. So it's just a good idea. It's not absolutely necessary. They're $10 or $15, and it's just a little protection for your pump. Again, usually a very expensive pump. So, and then that brings us back to vacuum chucks. Let me just move some stuff out of here. There's a lot of different variations in vacuum chucks. Again, you have your choices between making your own or buying store-bought chucks. This is a one-way chuck, and this was about it's about $135, I believe. It's a really heavy piece of cast aluminum. It comes you can put adapters in for whatever size you need, and it's a solid chuck. If I'm doing heavy work and a heavy piece that's on here, this is the one I'm going to use because it's rock solid. One Way also makes a smaller one, and that you can use. So that's one method. And then, as I showed you before, an advantage of a vacuum system is that you can make your own chucks. And these are constructed out of just a block of wood, some PVC pipe, and I'll go through construction of one of these a little later in the demo. But this is, I tend to use, well, this one uses a small faceplate on there, and there is a gasket. I just used a foam gasket underneath that faceplate to try to create a better seal. But again, just a small faceplate that's on there that holds it on there that I leave permanently attached to it. You don't want to be messing around with taking the faceplate on and off, because once you get this thing centered and true, you want it to keep running like that. One of the disadvantages of using something that's wood is that it does move, has the potential to move a little bit on you. So if you are making your own, I recommend that you finish these with some kind of finish that will minimize the distortion of the wood base on these. So you don't want to have to true it up every time you use it. This one here, I tried using One Way sells these adapters for their chucks that allow the chucks to be used in a variety of different lathes, and I just bought one of these adapters and tried that, and actually this works very well, and it's just screwed in there with 3 screws. This one uses plywood for the base, 2 layers of 3/4 inch, and if you're going to use plywood, make sure you use lumber grade plywood that doesn't have any voids in it, and plywood's more stable, so it doesn't move, and it's actually stronger as well for the given diameter. And then I use caulk around the base of this after I glued it in to get a good seal on it. So those are, and again, there's a number of different ways. You can use a lot of different things. My only caution or concern with the homemade ones is they are not as rugged as something like the one-ways. So you just have to realize that that's a homemade piece. You're stressing materials that aren't really designed to take that kind of load, and you just need to be cognizant of what loads you put on here and whether they're acceptable for doing it. And we'll talk more about the methods I use in order to strengthen these when we talk about how to make the chucks. So the other question that comes up often with these is what to use for gasket material. And there's a number of different things you can use. They're all very easy. My go-to is I use craft foam, and this is I buy this in packages from Michael's. It's sticky on the back. It's got self-adhesive on it, and it's cheap. I mean, it's a 9 by 12 sheet, I think, is about $1. So and by having it on there, you can change them as often as you need to. You don't have to worry about it being a problem. So that's one way. That is my go-to. And you can also put another layer on there if you need something. If you have slightly irregular surface, you have something that's not making a good seal, you can put a second layer on just to give you a little bit more cushion. So that's a good reliable source for these. And so that's what's on here. And you can see this had multiple layers on it. And again, you'll see that it has tool marks and cuts on it, and but you can just do that as often as you need to and replace it whenever you need it. And the key is don't skimp on it. If it looks like if it's nicked or chipped, or just go ahead and replace it, because you're not going to get a good vacuum on it. There are a number of other sources that you can use for gasket material. You can save, packing material. I've used old mouse pads, the thin ones. Any closed cell foam should work. This is floor underlayment for floating floors, like laminate, like Pergo and those types of things. I had a friend who was doing a floor, had this left over, and I probably have a 10-foot long piece that's 20 feet wide, or it's 20 foot long, 10 feet wide, and it'll last a lifetime. So that's what's on here. And if you use this, you just use spray adhesive, and you spray both the foam and your substrate, and you just wait till they tack up, and you just put it on there. And again, it's thinner. A lot of times I'll use multiple layers of this if I'm using it, but if I need something that really has to conform, sometimes this is a better choice than the foam that goes on here. So one of the beauties of the one-way system when you have to replace a gasket is that they make a nice little adapter to help you do it. So this is the gasket on this small one was worn out, and so I cut a foam donut. I sanded the old one off. I just hit it with 100 grit sandpaper. You just need to make it as clean as you can. You certainly don't want any irregularities in the surface. So if you do, just go ahead and clean it up. You can use Goo Gone or something like that to get the glue off if you need to. That's one of the advantages of using these self-stick foams rather than something that you have to use spray adhesive on, because it's much neater to use these. But the way this works is, I'm just going to hook up my system here. You just take the paper off. And get it about centered on there, and then one way gives you this nice little cap to turn your system on. And you pull it on, and then you just trim off the edges. But it just makes it, you get a good solid seal, but it just uses the vacuum to go ahead. You could, if you wanted, you could bring your tailstock up and hold it on there, and then you just trim this. You use this while it's on there to just trim the excess off, and you get a nice even surface on it. One caution about using the foam is that I stay away from black for some reason. I think whatever dye they use in the black, if your piece should slip at all on your chuck, sometimes the black will leave marks on there. So I use every color but black for this, and so it works well. So, and then I mentioned that if you have something that's kind of a bit of a rough surface on there, you can put another layer on there if you want, or you can even just take a piece of this, and a lot of times I'll just do this. I'll just cut a hole in the middle of this, and it doesn't even have to be glued on. You can take this and then just put something on there, and it'll hold it on there just fine. Again, it doesn't have to be glued, it just has to make a seal. So you can use multiple layers if you need. You have to be careful that it's not as secure, but it will hold it on there. If you have a surface that is slightly irregular, if some burls that aren't perfectly smooth. If you're doing something like ambrosia maple that may have holes in the wood, or you're doing something that is particularly, well, ambrosia maple is a good example. If you have a wormhole that's going through the side near where the chuck is, or the base, sometimes you can switch to a smaller chuck in order to not have that in the bottom. But if you do, a piece of masking tape on the outside, as long as it's not going through the part that you have to cut, a piece of masking tape on the outside will often be enough that it will give you enough support on that'll hold it, because the vacuum is pulling that tape in there. A dab of CA glue in a hole will also do the same thing if you can do that, if it's going through the base, for instance. So there are times where it's just not going to work, but the other thing I find that is you can actually use these chucks just to hold a piece on the lathe with your tailstock coming up, just if you're trying to true up the base before you return it, or to get your tenon or your recess fixed. They actually just make a good, just a holding method, instead of using the block like this. This already has the foam on it, and you can just use it as a compression to hold up there with the tailstock. So with that, I think we'll take a pause here and see whether you have any questions, and we will proceed on with talking about vacuum pumps.